Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the G20 Interfaith Forum 2020. I would like to welcome all of the participants joining us now from around the world. Almost 2,000 people have registered so far to participate, and we've had visitors from over 90 countries join us over the past 2 days. Welcome to all of you. This level of interest points to the relevance and reach of religious institutions in the global landscape today, and also to the breadth and scope of the field of interfaith dialogue. This connection and sharing is exactly what the G20 Interfaith Forum seeks to do, to create a network of networks, if you will, to support and strengthen religious actors, faith-based organizations, policymakers, and experts wherever they're working. On the first day of the G20 Interfaith Forum, we heard from a range of leading voices on the importance of religious thought, action, and leadership in the fight for social justice and human rights, identifying and addressing structural inequalities such as discrimination, racism, and ethnocentrism. The speakers emphasized the need for more inclusive education models to target hate speech and to preserve religious heritage, and committed to use their platforms to call for justice. Yesterday, in 4 sessions on the global pandemic sweeping the planet, we had a vivid sense of the extensive work being done by religious actors to combat COVID-19. In the words of one of the speakers, faith actors have a track record of being on the front line when crisis hits home, and that was very much in evidence in the discussions yesterday. If you've missed any of the sessions and would like to catch up, please visit our YouTube channel to view full recordings of the previous sessions, or visit CAICID or any of our partners, the G20 Interfaith Forum Association, the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations, and the National Committee for Interfaith and Intercultural Dialogue in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, either on our websites or on social media for other highlights. As a reminder, this particular session is available in English, Arabic, and Spanish, so please follow the instructions on the website to listen to the stream in your preferred language. Today, we reconvene to discuss inequality and inclusion, with a special focus on young people, women, and vulnerable groups. A keynote speech and plenary panel discussion will be followed by 3 concurrent panel discussions, all centered around this topic. We invite you to participate with questions and comments in the chat and to download the recommendations and policy briefs that are the basis for this event. Our plenary speaker today is His Excellency the Reverend Kjell Magne Bondevik, former Prime Minister of Norway and Executive Chair of the Oslo Center. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be with you today and to discuss this very important topic. We know that there are several sources of conflicts. It may be occupation, ethnicity, and religion. I don't believe that religion as such is a conflict source, but it is misused to stir up conflicts, as we experienced on the Balkans, on Ireland, and other countries. I am a Christian believer and even an ordained Lutheran pastor, but I have for more than 30 years been a politician and ended up as a prime minister. Now I am executive chair for the Oslo Center, working for democracy, human rights, and peace. In all these frameworks, I have been involved in interreligious dialogues, and I have experienced that believers understand each other and have much in common across different religions. And we can learn to live peacefully with our differences. But we should also focus more on our common values, because we have several of them in all the main religions. The idea of human dignity, the idea of peace, of justice, and respect for the holy. We find them in all religions. The knowledge of this helps break down the religious and cultural barriers that have been erected between peoples, societies, and individuals. At the Oslo Center, this is a part of our platform to work towards reconciliation and peace, with a strong emphasis on interfaith dialogue. All major world religions teach the virtue of peace, not just peace in the sense of absence of war, but peace between people. The Hebrew word for peace, shalom, and the Arabic word salam have the same root. Both have a broader meaning, referring to a state of mind, relations with other people, and relations with God. This is the same as the Christian blessing, peace be with you. Today, we experience that extreme groups like IS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, and others are misusing religion for their violent behavior and terror acts and manslaughter. I really feel sad when I see how such groups are doing such terrible acts in the name of God. Let us all stand up against this. As political and religious leaders, we have a responsibility to oppose any attempt to exploit social, economic, and other injustices in order to stir up religious hatred and suspicion. The world situation forces us to work hard to reduce tensions between religious groups. It may start from the top down and from the grassroots up, both ways at the same time. The dialogue must be based on reciprocity, confidence, and cooperation. I think that in this regard, education is an important means. Especially young people can be mobilized to promote respect, understanding, and tolerance. To counter conflicts that come from issues of religion, the religious leaders also have a great responsibility. They reach out to do so. They reach out to so many people, and they must use this opportunity to speak about religions as a source of reconciliation and peace, and to teach in a fair way about other religions and create tolerance for them. I will especially emphasize the importance of reaching out to young people, also in order to make the future leaders tolerant across religious, ethnic, and cultural borders. The Oslo Center has experience on making frameworks for young people to meet across such borders. We have had projects about this in South Sudan, in Myanmar, and now in the conflict-ridden coast area of Kenya, where we have contributed to establish peace clubs at universities and schools, where young people meet from different ethnic groups and religions. And we have also contributed to Mombasa Youth Assembly, which will now be enlarged to several assemblies in other regions. There they discuss, they create understanding towards each other, and they unite in common demands to the regional and national governments. Similar frameworks can be made for women and vulnerable groups. But most important is that tolerance and equality is integrated in all politics and public life. The challenge is to create inclusive societies where all groups, also minorities, have influence. Democracy is not that the winners take all. Democracy is also about how you treat the minorities. So let us fight against misuse of religion for tensions and conflicts, and turn it around to promote religion as a source of reconciliation and peace in order to make inclusive societies. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I would now like to welcome Dr. Agnes Abom, moderator of the Central Committee of the World Council of Churches and the moderator of our plenary panel discussion today, to introduce the other speakers.
Thank you so much. It's a great privilege for me to be the moderator of this very important session of the G20 Interfaith Forum 2020. The platform is basically on the empowerment of women, youth, and vulnerable people. We will be having about 8 speakers. They will each for 5 to 7 minutes from now on. May I then introduce the esteemed speakers of this plenary. And our first speaker will be Dr. Hala Altoarji, who is the Secretary General of the Family Affairs Council of Saudi Arabia and Head of Women's Empowerment Team at G20 Riyadh. The next speaker will be Mr. Ahmad Al-Hadwi. Sorry for the pronunciation of your names, please do forgive me. Secretary General of the World Organization of the Scout Movement. Our third speaker will be Professor Ursula Bassett, Professor of Pontifical Catholic University in Argentina. The fourth speaker will be our Chief Rabbi Shlomo Hofmeier of Vienna, Austria. Now 5 is Professor Azza Karam, who is the Religions for Peace Empowerment Team at G20 Riyadh, and also with the Religions for Peace. The 6th speaker will be His Excellency Mahmoud Meldin, the Special Envoy on Financing for Development. His Excellency Pramilan Patel, Special Representative and Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, will be number 7. And our final speaker is also Her Excellency Aminata Toure, President of the Economic, Social, and Environmental Council of Senegal. The purpose of this forum is basically to seek to understand how the various religious communities and organizations are empowering women in terms of the structures they have put in place and their programmatic contributions. At the end of the plenary, we hope we'll have some time when the plenary members will be able to raise a couple of questions. And of course, the contribution of His Excellency Shell Magne Bundevik, the former Prime Minister, will also be part of that plenary question and answer. So on that, may I humbly request the esteemed religious leaders in the order I read to begin to give us their presentation. Dr. Hala Altawad, please welcome. Can you hear? Please go ahead. Dr. Hala?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Your Excellencies, Your Eminencies, ladies and gentlemen, may peace and God's blessings be upon you. First of all, please allow me to express my gratitude and thanks for inviting me to participate in this very important and precious forum, which only reflects and stresses the concern and aspiration of all states of the world and of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to build bridges and enhance dialogue between religions and cultures, including the Kingdom's desire to chair the G20. The empowerment of women and paving the path for women to be granted equal chances is the main motto and drive for sustainable development. Religious institutions. Do you hear me? Thank you. So the empowering of women and paving the path for women to be granted equal chances is the main drive for sustainable development. Religious institutions are one of the motors and actors who enhance and promote the development of societies and who consolidate values and ethics in societies, which in return contributes to the process of development and progress of society. The empowerment of women is an integral part of sustainable and inclusive development. Countries shall not be able to achieve their economical development goals without the overall participation of women in all areas. Therefore, the chairmanship of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has committed itself to let the empowerment of women be its utmost priority for the 2020 agenda. Also, it is necessary to look at this topic as a whole, as it interferes and affects with all sectors working areas of the G20. During the year of the Saudi chairmanship of the G20 and abiding by the theme of realizing opportunities of the 21st century for all, activities focused on three major axes: empowering people, safeguarding the planet, and shaping new frontiers. In regard to the first topic, empowering of people, the G20 states put special emphasis on empowering women and providing opportunities for women which allows them to live, work, and thrive. That is, job opportunities for women, financial inclusion, and give more chances to women. On another note, till today, 980 million women around the globe are not able to receive access to basic financial services. This year, the Working Group for Empowering Women shed the light on a number of considerations closely linked to numerous priorities, as, for example, the participation of women in political dialogue, by examining the impact of policies and initiatives on the lives of girls and women. Another such consideration was to take the gender aspect into account for the access to resources and opportunities, as well as gathering categorized gender information and data when elaborating programs, policies, and objectives, or when monitoring and evaluating them. Thus, the Working Group on the Empowering of Women work together with the most other working groups and task forces and actively contributed to working fields related to the financial path and other working streams, including development, education, agriculture, recruitment and procurement of personnel, fight against corruption, health, tourism, trade and investment. The modern approaches of leadership in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia focuses on sustainable development, empowering women, girls, while preserving our religious and social values, starting with the basic law of governments, which state in Article 9, the nucleus of Saudi society is the family, and its members should be brought up on the basis of the Islamic creed. And this Article 10, the state shall endeavor to strengthen family bonds, maintain its Arab and Islamic values, care for all its members, and provide conditions conducive to the development of their talents. And according to the guidelines of the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, in this context, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has elaborated the necessary national framework to implement and realize these goals. Also, the Vision 2030 and the National Transformation Program, which focused on the contribution of women to economical and social development through raising their participation in the labor market in the various fields and professions from 22% to 30% by the year 2030, and eliminating all obstacles which might hinder women from accessing the labor market in order to achieve the goals of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in regard to the development and to empowering women and to ensuring equal chances and opportunities for both men and women. A close cooperation between religious institutions and decision makers was established by reforming, modernizing, and modifying the existing rules and regulations program, especially in regard to marriage, in regard to women's rights in cases of custody, alimony, and also in everything regarding marriage. Concluding, I'd like to say that the empowerment of women in my country follows an inclusive approach. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker, please, Mr. Ahmad Al-Hedawi.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, the moderator, and like at the outset to very much thank the co-conveners of this important discussion and express my gratitude and appreciation to our friends and colleagues at KAISED for their leadership, my brother, Dr. Faisal bin Muammar, and the excellent team who, despite all the challenges of convening during this year, they insisted in making sure that this convening will mark the G20 and will bring the agenda and the discussion among interfaith leaders to come to this important forum of the G20. So my huge appreciation to all of them on behalf of the World Organization of the Scout Movement. Switching to the topic of youth and empowerment of women and youth, let's be honest in facing the reality of our world today. When we see the impact that this pandemic is having in young people today, is not only severe, I would say it's catastrophic. We went into this pandemic already with the major challenges facing young people, complex challenges from unemployment to lack of access to proper and quality education or affordable education in cases where quality is not an issue. And looking at the delay of transitions, the transition to adulthood, transition to independence, the transition to form families, and all these transitions resulted in a generation in waiting. That generation in waiting during this year became not only in waiting, became also a generation in lockdown. This lockdown generation is really facing all these compounded challenges. And we're seeing today quite a destructive narrative directed towards young people by painting a picture where young people are the problem for development, or they are part of not helping us and efforts to counter the pandemic. We hear in the news, we hear in the media today a speech that is trying to portray young people as part of the problem in the global health crisis that we are facing today, that they are not cooperative and they are not supportive. And I wish sometimes to hear a little bit more recognition to understand what sacrifices young people are asked to make today in facing a year that is wasted, maybe more than a year, a youth that is frozen, access to opportunities that is becoming more difficult, and levels of unemployment that we have not seen before. And these challenges require the global leaders at all levels, and in this particular forum, the G20, to really step up to the challenge and understand that a blame game towards young people or putting the blame on them is not going to help us win them and engage with them, so they would be the partners that would help us navigate our way back to normalcy. Let's remember that the G20 was born at the levels of heads of states, came as a response to a global economic crisis back in 2008. And at that time, when the world recognized that to deal with a global financial crisis, we need more cooperation, where we need more collaboration, and we need to engage also non-state actors and civil society organizations, development banks, and know that Professor Mohideen is in this call. I think I speak very competently about the role of financing and bringing also other actors to be part of this global response to the pandemic. But today we're seeing, and if we draw a parallel between the response to 2008 and compare it today with the way that we're responding to the pandemic, I think the G20 has an important role to play. The international community, represented by the international organization, whether the UN, World Bank, IMF, and others, have a very important role to play. Regional organizations, they have an important role to play. I come here to say that as an organization that believes so strongly in the value of dialogue and the value of engaging with the religious leaders, we believe religious leaders, they also have a role to play. In our partnership with KCID over the years, we have achieved wonders, in fact, in our ability to bring the values of dialogue, the tools as well, and the understanding of its importance to places that they have been torn by conflicts and by deep divides. Together, we have reached over 111 countries where we trained young leaders and dialogue for peace and the culture of peace, and in promoting and becoming peace builders in their communities. And as we see today, trends that are not fully constructive towards achieving the bold agenda that the world has arrived to in 2015, whether from the Sustainable Development Goals or the financing for development or the climate change agenda, or all these important and landmark frameworks that the world agreed to achieve over the next couple of years, they are today facing a setback and saying also deprioritization, and the world at large is facing a trend of deglobalization with all these wars and conflicts that we are witnessing that are taking different forms and shapes. So back to where young people in all of this is a youthful word. I mean, half of the world's population under the age of 25. Spend a lot of my career trying to remind policymakers and leaders that it's time really to turn to that generation, and the existential crises that young people are facing today, whether when it comes to climate change, they will not be even in a position to say after 30 or 40 years that some of the damage that is caused today can be reversed. So some of the crises we're dealing with, namely climate change, are quite irreversible. And we have seen how young people are taking to the streets, voicing their concerns, and really forming a global movement just before the pandemic, and saying that it's time to action, time to listen to this generation, time to live in a more sustainable way, and time to prioritize the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals and all these important agreements. I look to this convening of the G20 at large and this important track that established in the context of the G20 for religious leaders to continue really engaging young people. And I think, as the moderator said at the very beginning, religious leaders are always there and answering the call of a duty and supporting and increasing the resilience of their communities, and by really expanding and working with youth organizations and other actors, I think we will stand a better chance to come out of this pandemic with a better structure, better word, and lead the new normal and the way to normalcy in a more inclusive way, in a more greener way, and in a more sustainable way following this pandemic. So one of the key messages I just want to put today, and my encouragement also to religious leaders, as someone leading the World Organization of the Scout Movement and working with 171 national organizations, over 54 million scouts. If there's one message I wish to pass into this discussion and ask for all of you to support us, let's not double punish young people during this pandemic. One time over all the sacrifices they are making, all the challenges they are facing, and the second time over portraying them as part of the problem. That will not leave us anywhere. If anywhere, it will further marginalize and delay our ability to get out of this big challenge that is facing us today. So that's my message. And once again, I'm very grateful for the co-conveners and very proud of the partnerships, the strong partnership we have established with religious leaders to ensure that the Scout movement is continue to celebrate the diversity and the collective desire of all of us to live in a more peaceful and prosperous world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hamad Al-Hedawi. Shall we then now have Professor Ursula, please? Is she there? Professor? Yes. Welcome, Professor. She's speaking in Spanish.
The problem.
We have a slight problem.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, then I can start. Sorry. Well, I will center
Yes.
my short speech in women empowerment and religion. I wish to thank you so much for letting me be a part of this. I hope I'm not going to be too controversial. First, I want to speak about narratives of empowerment. The quest of empowerment has created narratives of women. Feminism, one of the narratives, or said better, the various forms of feminism, each of them give back a picture of women. Women are constructed, deconstructed, and reconstructed, and too often this process, much like to modern art, it ends up creating an illusion, a simplified abstraction with a linear perspective of women according to the various views of the various feminisms. We should always keep in mind, as the famous picture of the Belgian artist René Magritte, and to hold on to the artistic metaphor, that this is not a pipe. The depiction of women by the narrative of feminism is still a depiction whose outcome depends on too many factors. For instance, when women are portrayed in a historical perspective of conflict, as useful as approach might be to shed light on the empowerment movement, we should be reminded, not without amazement, that the history relies on the ground of the beneficial interaction between men and women. Second part, embedded. Speaking of history, the movement for empowerment has tried so hard to render visible the relevant women in the past of our religions and our societies. We celebrate greatly when a woman reached or has reached a place in which we would otherwise find men. In the ancient history and later on, we find women philosophers, women who bear authority in a religion or in a state. And this is a very noble thing to do. It is a way to cherish women in our past and render them a justified tribute. And this brings me back to the issue of the silences in the narratives of empowerment. Where do you find a celebration for each woman who bore a child and raised him? Notwithstanding the great women that we honor, what about the silent heroes to which we owe our being here today? Please understand me well. Not that I'm against any progress of women in the public sphere. I'm a professional, and I work very much in science, in politics, in religion. Quite the opposite. I'm in favor of the progress of every woman on every ground, but of women in their uniqueness, of women, I underline, celebrating every woman for what she is, not for conforming to a narrative of our choice. Do women that do not conform to many powerful narratives of feminism still have a place in our consideration? Because we might be breeding new forms of discrimination if we pick up which women we like and which women we dislike. 3, body. The body is the temple of the woman's soul. However, some narratives of empowerment emphasize independency. Independency of men, independency of religion, independency over bodies. Women's bodies are fragile and strong at the same time. In their fragility, they bear the strength of hope to humanity. According to some narratives, women should be able to decide to deny their body, according to some rhetorics, in order to be able to take equal part and equal standing in society. And I wonder if these rhetorics do imply freedom to choose, or if women are in fact pushed to deny themselves in order to conform a narrative that departs from a manly model. I believe in an empowerment in which every woman is granted her right to be a woman. And this means to choose a life that does not fit necessarily in the mainstream narratives. And that we owe it to women to reach a real equality. That empower means to empower every woman, taking her for what she is, not depriving her of her religious values, her beliefs, herself and her body, valuing the uniqueness in every domain and not downplaying the role of this woman who do not conform to the norm. There is no empowerment in denial of the woman. And this brings me back to my last point, gender. I was delighted to be invited to a panel on women and empowerment. As much as the term gender is of widespread use, underlying women is thinking of their specific agenda, neutrality. To neutralize the very word woman means also a silence in the narratives, a theoretical form of muting our rights. To name women and to think of their specific agenda is also a form of empowerment. Putting all the pieces together, there is no empowerment if it does not address every woman in body and soul for what they are, for what they choose to be. As many studies show already, religion fits in holding the whole of what a woman is, in re-embedding her in their families and in their societies. And I really think this is the main contribution that it might give. Thank you very much.
As I've said, we'll now have the Secretary General of Religions for Peace and also the lady that is in charge of the government team with her team at the G20 Riyadh. Professor Azza Karam.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all our listeners, and a sincere and heartfelt warm greeting to you, Dr. Agnes, a mentor of many years, to all of us who work in the faith and interfaith spaces. Thank you very much to the conveners and organizers of this very important forum. I would like to pay special tribute to a woman behind so much of the G20 interfaith work, and that is Professor Catherine Marshall. So warm greetings to the women organizers and obviously the male counterparts in this space as well. It is such an honor and a privilege to be here with all of you. I just wanted to share that I'm not necessarily sure I'm doing anything on the G20 at all beyond the privilege of speaking here. I do, however, serve Religions for Peace, which for colleagues and listeners who may not yet know is celebrating its 50th year of existence today. Religions for Peace is the United Nations of religions. Just as the United Nations has member states or governments, Religions for Peace has member religious institutions and members and representatives of religious communities. It is the largest interfaith structure that serves religious institutions and represents all of them simultaneously. One of the other distinguishing features of Religions for Peace is the presence of interreligious councils, affiliated interreligious councils, in 94 countries. They are national and regional in nature. These interreligious councils are legally registered, multi-religious leadership institutional platforms for each of the nation's religious communities, and that includes the indigenous peoples. It is therefore a very unique structure in terms of both its religious institutional representation and in terms of its country presence. One of the most amazing things about Religions for Peace's work that we are learning over the last 5 decades is how central and how significant it is to have multi-religious collaborative platforms, not only in times of crisis, but also in regular periods and spaces. As we speak about women and about youth, which, by the way, is a bit problematic because, quite frankly, women includes youth, youth includes women, and yet in our incredible enlightenment-infused thinking and action, we still tend to nicely try to categorize human beings, which is, by the way, a little bit problematic, but let's, for the sake of conversation, let's acknowledge this ridiculous dichotomy and try to use it nevertheless. One of the lessons we're learning from 5 decades of working with multi-religious religious institutional representatives, but also women of faith and youth networks. Religions for Peace has the largest women of faith network around the world. It also has the largest interfaith youth network because they work together within these interreligious councils. The lessons we're learning are the following: that when we wish to ensure that a narrative of women's empowerment and gender equality, not just women's empowerment, but women's empowerment and gender equality, when we wish to promote that narrative, that multi-religious collaboration, that a discourse that brings together the various discourses of different religions can be one of the most empowering means of realizing gender equality and building the sensitivity of communities to the value and presence not only of women, but of the feminine. When religions are convened on their own steam, so to speak, some religions have been able already to steward women into positions of leadership, intellectual, conceptual, but also very much practical in their own institutions. But when religions come together, that is the moment of the greatest boost to any discourse around gender equality and women's empowerment. That is a lesson we've learned from 5 decades of work. It's not a theoretical perspective. It's a lesson we've learned based on working on these issues for 5 decades. Religions for Peace did something unheard of in December of 2019. It convened over 200 religious leaders, each representing their religious institutions, and together came up with a strategic plan for 2020 to 2025. Now, that strategic plan in and of itself is normal business for any organization. What makes Religions for Peace's endeavor interesting, beyond the fact that for the first time in interfaith history, 250 religious leaders can come together and actually strategically plan and agree to something together, but what makes it even more interesting is precisely the fact that this strategic plan is modeled almost identical verbatim to the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. Why? Because if 193 governments can come together and agree to a Sustainable Development Goals agenda, which encapsulates peace and security, human rights, and sustainable development, then surely the religious leaders and institutions of the world can and should honor such a process of global commitment. And thus, Religions for Peace has been able to create the momentum and the intention and indeed the prerogative of action of trying to ensure that the Sustainable Development Goals agenda will be and is also predicated upon the work of religious institutions and religious leaders together as they contribute to the civic and governmental space and schedule. One of the most interesting things is that gender equality and women's empowerment is one of those goals that the religious leaders representing the religious institutions around the world have actually agreed to try to serve together. And already a number of amazing initiatives have taken place. We've heard a lot about COVID and the challenges that it poses. I'd like to share one opportunity that a global pandemic is also presenting. And this particular opportunity is one where, as we see the spikes in gender-based violence as a result of the lockdowns and the restrictions on movement and mobility, in order to precisely to prevent the spread of the virus, as we see the spike in gender-based violence, we also see a remarkable spike in the interfaith collaboration that is taking place around and for the safeguarding, the nurturing, and the advancement of women's health and their earning power globally. Religions for Peace created a multi-religious humanitarian support fund with the understanding that for the next few years, unfortunately, humanitarian crisis will be a very important and defining feature of our lives on this planet. The crises are not only man-made because of tremendous amounts of conflicts intra and interstate, but also they're crises that we're likely to confront as a result of the fact that we have thoroughly ruined and are doing a fine job of continuing to genuinely damage our environment. So whether we like it or not, we will be confronted with the consequences of so much of this environmental degradation that we are causing ourselves. This means that we are looking at the next 20 to 25 years of humanitarian crises as a defining feature. The global pandemic today is but one of what what we fear will be many such crises we have to confront. Therefore, there's no point of thinking about achieving the Sustainable Development Goals agenda if we don't realize that we're going to be working in crisis mode for the next few years. In order to do this, we have to be very deliberate, because Religions for Peace is committed to multi-religious collaboration. In order to be able to confront the next few years, we have to make sure that we have a vehicle that will enable and indeed insist, be determined to support multi-religious collaboration in times of humanitarian crises. The Multi-Religious Humanitarian Support Fund was created as a mechanism by Religions for Peace and offered as a gift to any and all religious and secular actors who would see value in contributing to a fund that is aimed primarily to support multi-religious collaboration in the years to come. We're still waiting for some of the governments and some of these venerable religious institutions to see the value of actually supporting multi-religious collaboration. The invitation is there for any and all of you. If you see that support and the value of it, please consider putting our resources where our mouths are and trying to support multi-religious humanitarian engagement in the years to come. We all need it. Why do we need it? We need it because social cohesion is one of the first victims of what we are seeing happening around us today in terms of geopolitical dismemberment, but also in terms of the increasing conflicts and the lack of efficient governance around the world. Social cohesion is the first victim of what we are confronting. In order to insist on countering forces that break us apart, we need to be very determined in supporting the coming together. Religious leaders and religious institutions have long predated all of the institutional structures as we know today. It is therefore absolutely paramount that they are deliberate in coming together to support all populations at all times. And this is why our insistence as Religions for Peace is to support the religious institutions, religious leaders, the women of faith, the interfaith youth, to be able to come together in order to work together. The key, the magic, is collaboration. Multi-religious collaboration is a tipping point for social cohesion. And this is what Religions for Peace is committed to working with CAICID and all other interreligious and United Nations system partners to help realize. Multi-religious collaboration in order to secure social cohesion going forward is a commitment that we make as Religions for Peace, and to work together with others to do this. And last but by no means least, I think it's very important for us to acknowledge the following. This is a G20 Interfaith Forum. It's a very critical moment and opportunity to communicate certain requests to our G20 members, government members. And there's one request that I would like to make very profoundly, which is, apart from multi-religious collaboration as a very important necessity, not a luxury and not an add-on, but a very determined road to support. But apart from that, I think the G20 Forum will serve the world best when it serves the United Nations, when it serves multilateralism, not when it becomes its own separate, distinct, and unique convening space, but when it actually is rallying the communities, nations, non-governmental organizations, businesses, rallying all to the support of the United Nations system. If we did not have a United Nations before, we would have had to create it now. We have a United Nations system. We need to support it. The G20 should be very deliberate in ensuring the survival, indeed the thrival, of the United Nations system. That is also what Religions for Peace is committed to working to ensure: the support and the sustenance of the multilateral mechanism as we know it, as we have it, to try to improve, but also to try to strengthen. Nothing is perfect, and certainly no institution today, in a time of the crisis and lack of legitimacy of all institutions, no institution is perfect, no institution will be perfect. But working together to ensure and safeguard the primacy of the multilateral United Nations system is a matter of survival. We want to support youth. We want to ensure that women's decision-making is enabled significantly, that women don't have to be different from who they are in order to be taken seriously. If we want to ensure all of this, global civil society is a very key factor towards realizing this. But global civil society will never be able to exist without a very powerful multilateral system. The multilateral system requires global civil society. Global civil society's power depends on its ability to integrate the multi-religious voices. The equation is very simple. If we wish to survive and thrive institutionally, we need to support the United Nations system. We need to support the United Nations system, support global civil society actors and initiatives. In order to ensure the survival of those, we need multi-religious institutions working together, not working distinctly, in order to prove the value of the individual religion or its adherents. All faiths urge us to work towards the most vulnerable. I happen to think that women are not universally the most vulnerable all the time and victimized all the time. I happen to think women are also a remarkable power, potential, and group. And some of the most critical actors in the civic space and in the intergovernmental space are women. And some, slowly, of the most critical actors in the interreligious space are also women. Dr. Agnes Obom is the chair of the World Council of Churches, which is the largest ecumenical infrastructure in the world, and is as old as and as venerable as the United Nations. There are many others. We need to pay tribute to the global civic infrastructure. We need to ensure that the G20 supports the United Nations in supporting global civil society. Thank you.
Please, wide enough. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, Chief Rabbi, I omitted your name, unfortunately, and went straight to Professor Azza, but please take the space. The next speaker is actually Chief Rabbi Shalom Hofsmais. Please excuse my pronunciation. Welcome, Chief Rabbi. So sorry.
Excellencies, no problem at all. Excellencies, eminencies, distinguished audience, ladies and gentlemen, dear brothers and sisters. As Jewish tradition teaches, God did not create man in his image. Rather, God created the human in his image. And the human was created as man and woman, and as such, both were created in his image. Descending from the first human beings, all the nations of the world emerged, all peoples on this planet, each and every one of us, created in his image. As much as all of us will agree that equality, dignity, and justice for all human beings are, at least theoretically, for each of us, amongst the most basic values at the core of our religious beliefs, we do all know that our worldly reality, not only, yet also in religious circles, is far from matching these ideals. It is not without reason that the Holy Scriptures feel the need to emphasize countless times over and over again the importance of protecting and supporting the oppressed and the most vulnerable, mentioning as classic examples the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. And yet, as the history of international politics has shown, a patronizing approach is neither desired nor helpful, but counterproductive. Yes, awareness is essential. Yes, education is essential. And yes, also civil rights are essential. But from a global scale down to the individual family, empowering those who suffer from inequality because of an unequal distribution of power can only be achieved when those claiming power and supremacy over others are willing and prepared to give up. As the protection of the vulnerable can only be achieved by giving them the power and the ability to protect themselves. We do not need to reform our religious beliefs and truthful traditions, but we have to apply them in practice against bad habits and thus, oftentimes, against culturally and politically established norms and interests. As religious leaders, it is our utmost responsibility to raise constant awareness for the unacceptable discrepancy between the practiced reality, sometimes, most absurdly, even in the name of religion and its traditions, and the ethical ideals at the heart of every religion. It is our religious duty to denounce all those isms as absolutely incompatible with even the most fundamental of our religious values, to fearlessly speak out against all forms of nationalism, racism, ageism, sexism, and disabilism, to name only a few, and to never turn a blind eye on crimes such as domestic violence, child abuse, and sexual violence of any sort. The discrimination, oppression, and abuse of others, be it socially, economically, or physically, is without doubt nothing less than a sacrilege, as every human being was created in his image. Differentiating between religion and its authentic traditions on the one hand, and various, in fact unrelated, purely cultural phenomena, which are, however, far too often wrongly identified as being part of religion, is, in my humble opinion, absolutely essential in order to prevent the abuse of religion by conservative, populist, and right-wing political agenda. Refocusing on the true ethical values and ideals is the key, which will encourage and contribute to the empowerment of those most vulnerable and practically disadvantaged in our world, allowing religion to be a vital contributor to social justice and the advancement of equality, fairness, and peace in the world. Thank you.
Move on to His Excellency Mahmoud Mohedi. Mahmoud.
Right.
Yeah, welcome.
Thank you so much, excellent moderator, Dr. Agnes. I'm very pleased to be with you all in this important event as part of the G20 forum and the good discussion that we have been having so far. And I'd just like to put some emphasis on some of the important concepts that have been repeated with the various speakers before me. And to remind ourselves as well of the kind of exposure this coronavirus had really shown us during the last few months. As mentioned by the Secretary General in his Mandela speech back in July, that this COVID-19 virus had revealed the fractures and the ills in our societies and how fragile the skeleton of the society have been during the previous year, the previous decades. So we cannot blame everything that we have today only on the virus, despite the fact, of course, it had really had devastating effects on the lives of people, their health, their well-being, their jobs, and there is something that is accumulating fast that we need to work on together in order to deal with before it becomes a catastrophe, which is death. So one wonders if we are in this kind of faith and religious kind of discussion, what that has to do with all of these charts that I'm sharing with you today. I'm putting that just as a reminder of all of these figures that have been floating. And this is like a dashboard telling us the ills and problems that the world is facing today, from the contraction of the world economy, as we are officially in recession, to the decline in remittances. And as we know, remittances of workers abroad are directly support families, including women and the youth. There are issues as well when it comes to trade, and here the business, the markets, the job opportunities are being affected because of the decline of trade. And there is no surprise with these kind of economic circumstances because of the COVID-19 and the lockdown that the peace winner of the World Food Program, one of the important UN entities, had mentioned several times that we are facing an acute of more than 250 million people are facing hunger today. And with a problem that we haven't seen since 1998, with the number of the extreme poverty rising by 100 million people during the last few months. So work of many years under the Millennium Development Goals and more recently under the Sustainable Development Goals had been really exposed to this kind of vulnerability. And of course, there are issues of great concern related to the welfare of women and the young, as we have seen it in different crises. If there is a problem, women tend to suffer more. If there is a crisis, women tend to suffer more. If there is inequality and lack of access, women and the young people suffer more. Dr. Hala at the beginning mentioned something about access to market. And here, being in my village in Egypt, I'm reminded of this fact, not just in my village, it could be better than others, that if you are talking about access to finance for financial inclusion, you can consideration. And if you consider the advanced economies are really the benchmark, if you happen to be in a developing economy, you are losing more opportunities, like 10 to 15 notches down. If you happen to be in a rural part of a developing economy, you are losing, again, an opportunity to access to finance by 8 to 10 notches. And then if you happen to be a woman, you are losing more. If you happen to be under the age of 20, you are losing more. So there is no wonder that where access to finance in some advanced economies is close to 95% and 100% in some cases, in some of the developing countries, especially in rural areas, the access to finance averages, especially for the women and young people, are much than 15% in many economies around the world. Next slide, please. So, as a response to the crisis, the Secretary General convened meetings. I don't know if this slide is clear enough for you. It's not clear for me here, but I'll just explain it. So since May the 28th, we had a heads of state meeting convened by the Secretary General and the Prime Ministers of Jamaica and Canada. And we worked hard for many weeks, convening international organizations, private sector, civil society, and more than 25 UN units working with international organizations, try to provide the solutions for exactly what you were talking about today: inclusive growth, dealing with inequality, dealing with the problems of building back better, and including the problems of sustainability and climate change. How to deal with the debt crisis, especially for the most vulnerable economies. How to deal with the issues related to illicit financial flows, because you cannot talk about finance, as my good friend Mr. Hinda mentioned, without really talking debt management and debt restructuring. And we cannot talk about finance and debt while we see the money of the people is being stolen under the concepts of illicit financial flows, and this has to stop. And I think there is some good religious reference to that for it to be stopped. So I can really see the role here of religious leaders and faith-based communities to do many things. The emphasis on dignity, the emphasis on the human dignity and fairness and justice need really to be coupled with actions in the field. How can we avail finance to those who need it from public sources, not just from donations, but again from opportunities? And people talked before me about empowerment. My young daughter, very combative when it comes to argument of women, and very argumentative. When she says, well, empowerment, and she's an engineer, she's a trained engineer. If you are empowering, you will have the power to empower. So what we need is fair opportunity, and that fair opportunity needs to be lost in there through laws, regulations, and policies and practice in the field. So if I talk about finance and the opportunities, if I talk about debt and debt restructuring, I would really go back to these kind of principles for our legislators, for our governments, for creditors, and those who are advancing finance to go back to these basics in order to prevent crisis coming. And when it comes to debt in particular, and I mentioned that earlier, there is unprecedented accumulation of debt. Governments, by corporates, and by the households. The Financial Times a few weeks ago mentioned to the Old Testament, calling for a trumpet to be sounded on the 10th day of the 7th month every 50 years, and for debts to be cancelled and all servitude to be revoked. In the Holy Quran, there are rules very clearly put in the Holy Quran about debt forgiveness for those who cannot afford paying back their debts. So we need really to operationalize these important concepts and remind our legislators, our banks, our central banks, our finance ministers that these basically the basics that decent societies, inclusive societies, resilient societies are built on, and we cannot really compromise on that. My final slide, please. I hope it's the one before last, but I'll skip it because I already mentioned that. So this is the work of the different groups talking about the term, midterm, long-term measures. And then this final slide, again, I cannot see it very well from where I am here, but it has two sides. It has a side about the real economy, about building back better. And there are many economies in the world that you can really consider building back better. Them is a great thing. But given that we are not really in that one ship, some areas are much better, like strong ships, like super yachts as well. But we shouldn't really be forgetting that many of us are living in broken boats, as mentioned again by the secretary when he was talking about the fallacy of being in one ship. So that one ship because of the great discrimination inequality. So when we are building back better or building for better, we need to put that into consideration when we are, yes, much better now, thank you. So we need to go for availing jobs for those who lost their jobs. 500 people, exactly 495 million people, as per the ILO, lost their jobs during the last few months. How many of them will be coming back? How many of them will be denied access to jobs again? Issues related to growth. Can you talk about inclusive growth without education, without training? What about those millions who cannot have access to education because they are suffering from the digital inequality, being on the wrong side of the digital progress and not with access to education or training or opportunities? If we're talking about building back better or building better, and people before me on the panel mentioned strongly issues related to the environment and climate. So we need to take this kind of crisis to restructure and not just to focus on the emergency, which is very important, but we need to link the short-term measures to the midterm measures and the long-term measures, as exactly done by the European Union through their fund recovery, that while they are pushing this and the finance through 750 billion euros to be leveraged to provide jobs and opportunities and social protection and access to those who are in need. At the same time, there is an attention to build back better, greener, and to adhere to the engagements on matters related to climate and climate change. Having said that, on the real economy, we cannot do it without finance, without debt restructuring, including the. And please help us. The General is pushing hard to deal with the issues related to tax haven, to work against profit shifting, for denying countries their rights of their money. A recent report by UNCTAD said that Africa alone is losing more than $90 billion every year because of illicit financial flows. This is more than enough for all of the requirements of the SDGs related to education, health, and the rest of the half of the SDGs. Imagine that half of the sustainable goals for the African continent will not be relying on donation, will not be relying on any kind of just by preventing their own money to be put on the wrong bank accounts under any notion. So this is much important to consider. Really serious about taking these important principles of beliefs. I really like the keynote speech by the executive secretary of the Oslo Center. I subscribe to what he said fully, but to operationalize it, we need really to get that into action. And this action needs to be national level, at the local level. Community is very important. Raghu Rajan, the very well-known economist, wrote a very interesting about the missing pillar, the third pillar. We always talk about government and always talk about private sector. This is important, but we shouldn't be missing the chance of considering the role of community, including the leadership of the community when it comes to the faith-based organizations and the general public in their communities and their localities and municipalities. But that is not just about words. This is about action, about laws, about regulations, and about finance to be availed for these opportunities to be realized. Otherwise, we'll be just talking about them and we see the suffering around us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency Modin, UN Special Envoy, Financing for Development. Now we move on to His Excellency Premilan Patten, who is a special envoy, a special representative, of the UN Secretary General on sexual violence in conflict. Welcome.
Thank you. Excellencies, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to express my gratitude for the invitation, but also to commend the organizers for a very timely and successful forum. 25 years ago in Beijing, the world made a promise: equal rights and opportunities for all women and girls everywhere. As we take stock, it is clear that despite significant gains, the implementation of the Beijing Platform for Action has fallen short of its initial promise. Poverty, discrimination, and violence are still strongly present in the lives of women and girls. Underrepresentation in power and decision-making is still the norm. 32 million girls of primary age are still out of school. 1 in 5 girls undergo forced early marriage. Conflict and humanitarian crises have become more complex and protracted in the past 25 years, leaving women and girls more vulnerable than ever before, especially to sexual violence. With the COVID pandemic, even the limited gains made in the past decades are at risk of being rolled back. The public health crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic is fast becoming an economic and social crisis, and a protection and human rights crisis rolled into one. It has exacerbated the vulnerability of the least protected in society. The virus does not discriminate, but its impact do. Women, children, youth, and older persons, IDPs, refugees, migrants, people with disabilities, minorities, among other vulnerable groups, are all being affected differently. For women, entrenched gender discrimination, higher socioeconomic vulnerability, exacerbated domestic violence in lockdowns, and frontline roles as caregivers and medical workers has all meant higher exposure and more precarity. Women confined at home with abusers, without access to shelters and other services, are at greater risk of domestic violence. Women's economic and productive lives have been almost shattered. Their productive lives are affected disproportionately and differently from men. As markets fall and business grows, millions of women's jobs have disappeared. The instability and fear that the pandemic engenders is exacerbating existing human rights concerns. as discrimination against certain groups, hate speech, xenophobia, attacks and forced returns of refugees and asylum seekers, mistreatment of migrants, and sexual and gender-based violence. The pandemic is creating hardship, which, if not mitigated, will raise tension and could provoke civil unrest. Peace and sustainable development can only be achieved through the inclusion of all groups without discrimination. Ladies and gentlemen, faith has a unique place in our lives, particularly relating to how to treat others as we would like to be treated. In times of great anxiety, faith can be a significant source of comfort and community resilience. It is faith-based organizations and religious leaders equipped with courage and vision who play a unique role in bringing people together around the universal values of our common humanity. This is a time when human rights are needed to navigate this crisis. As the Secretary General puts it recently, our shared human condition and values must be a source of unity, not division. We must give people hope and a vision of what the future can hold. The human rights system helps us to achieve the global stability, solidarity, pluralism, and inclusion on which we all depend. It points to the ways in which we can transform hope into concrete action with real impact on people's lives. I commend all faith-based organizations for their leadership and efforts to promote interfaith understanding and peaceful coexistence and issues related to sustainable development. This is the time for religious leaders to use their moral authority to address gender-based violence, to advocate for the empowerment of women and girls, their access to employment, education, health facilities, as well as discrimination and xenophobia against vulnerable groups. My office works very closely with religious leaders, as highlighted in the Plan of Action for Religious Leaders and Actors to prevent incitement to violence that could lead to atrocity crimes. Because of their influence and authority in the communities they serve, religious leaders and faith actors are very well positioned to curb stigma, discrimination, and violence, and can be valuable gender equality champions. I would like to commend the work of the ACT Alliance, composed of 145 churches working in over 120 countries and focusing on the promotion of gender equality. I also commend the work of Musawa for continuing to enhance gender equality and justice in Muslim contexts. I would also like to pay special tribute to late Baba Sheikh, the spiritual leader of the Yazidi, for his leadership and humanity in combating the stigmatization of Yazidi women who were enslaved by ISIL, as well as of their children born from rape. The United Nations is sparing no effort to support faith actors in promoting the advancement of women and youth, as well as the protection of vulnerable groups, especially during the current pandemic. The UN Interagency on Religion and Development, which my office chairs, jointly with the UN Alliance of Civilizations and UNFPA, works closely with the Faith-Based Advisory Council, consisting of 40 faith-based organizations to promote gender equality and women's empowerment. My office is also supporting the implementation of the Global Call for Action, a declaration of commitment by religious leaders and actors to partner with the United Nations to respond to the multidimensional repercussions of the current pandemic. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to turn the crisis into opportunity and build back better. This outbreak has resulted in the spread of stigmatizing and discriminatory actions towards specific groups and communities. COVID-19 is not only challenging global health systems, but testing our common humanity. We must remember that the threat and enemy is the virus, not the people or countries or their religions. Hence, we must seize this opportunity to anchor the empowerment of women and youth, as well as the protection of vulnerable groups at the center of recovery plans at global, regional, and national level. These plans need to be fully embedded in fundamental human rights and values. They must be inclusive, equitable, and universal and leave no one behind. In these difficult times, we can see beacons of hope and the seeds of future unity of purpose. Our role is to nurture those seeds, and I have no doubt that the work of religious leaders and faith actors will continue to serve and inspire the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency Pramila Patten, Special Representative of the UN Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict. Our last but not least speaker is Her Excellency Aminata Toure, President of the Economic, Social and Environmental Council of Senegal. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be part of this panel on how to empower women and youth and vulnerable people by working with faith-based organization in this context of COVID especially. Let me recall maybe for all of us that in Africa, we've been the continent that is less infected so far. And well, we cross fingers, and the catastrophic scenario that were announced, in different places didn't happen. So that is something we are happy about, and it didn't happen randomly. It's the result of the work of African leadership in different ways and manners, building upon our experience of managing pandemics. And it was a little bit unfortunate that at the beginning of the pandemic, we couldn't expect Africa to handle that, and we did, and it's a good thing, and we have to build upon it. Let me talk about my experience here in Senegal, which is pretty much the same in West Africa and Africa, when it comes to the nexus between the pandemic and religious group. As you know, first of all, let me recall that Africa is a very young continent. 70% of the population is below 35. So, the regular African would be a young man or a young woman. With a lot of, if you look into that deeper, 20% even of the population is age 10, 19, which is sort of important when we would like to think about strategies to put in place to empower both women and young people. What we have seen in Senegal and in Africa is two lot of, say, attitude from the different groups. That's why when we talk about faith-based organization, it's important that we sort of also categorize them. And we had that issue here in Senegal. They've been, in one hand, the best enabler to apply prevention measures and safety measures, but at the same time, the worst discourse we have heard came also from other faith-based organizations. And Africa being a very religious continent, there was a Gallup studies later on showing that Senegal is among one of the biggest country with numbers of believers in Africa, and I think after it was Latin America. But just to say that religion is very, very, very important in the continent. And unfortunately, since the fall, I would say, of Libya, the West Africa countries have been seriously impacted, and Mali first, with the rise of terrorism and the rise of conservatism as a whole. Starting from Nigeria, it was pretty much sort of within the north of Nigeria. And after the collapse of Libya, sorry to say so, because I should be more diplomatic, but after the troubles in Libya, I would say, we had to face a situation that wasn't known, at least for many countries in West Africa, and it has impacted even the way our faith-based organization react and are involved. I must say, as someone who worked for a long, long time with faith-based organization, even before I went to the UN, I can tell you that we have now fewer progressive religious organizations. And that is a work that we need to sustain if we would like to see a positive implication of faith-based organization when it comes to empowering women and young people. This wind of conservatism today is also blowing among the religious community that we have seen in the past, much more involved in issues related to human rights, which is, to my mind, a question that we need to also reflect upon within the organization of faith-based organization that would like to promote human rights. What should be the new approach? What should be the most critical issue to deal with, so we can move forward. But from my part of the world, what I have seen is sort of less engagement. There's still, but less engagement compared to a decade ago. The issues of reproductive health, which is a key one for a young continent like us, the issue of violence against women, the issue of racism that also need to be addressed, should be at the core of the work of faith-based organization, and reaching out to also secular movement is also something that we're working upon. And it be, I would say, faith-based organization can come to the rescue of multilateralism in this time of coronavirus. The first collateral damage of this pandemic was the complete collapse or meltdown of multilateralism, with the closing of borders, the interruption of the payment chain that also collapsed, and now we are still trying to get the pieces together. So I would see faith-based, and I precised progressive faith-based organization coming to the rescue of multilateralism. That's why I think it's very important that their voice be represented in multilateralism and in international meetings. Here in Africa, what we would like to see, because I'm trying to be very practical also, what's the next step, is to revivify what happened before, which are networks of religious leaders, of organizations, on very specific topics that are dear to women and young people. When it comes to young people, and that is something we have to have a thought about, is how are we going to make sure that our youth is not sort of more attracted by very extremist languages, because of extreme poverty, because of despair, and because of the situation of being disfranchised. So that is something that can come out of this discussion, and we would be happy to support that, at least from Senegal, where I am, and for the rest of the continent, and reaching hands to different parts of the world. These networks need also to have a reality at the ground level. And that, as I said, we do have here sort of a very eclectic situation where you do have faith-based organizations that have been very advanced, very believing in science and in the medical discourse, and another ones that was sort of very dismissal of evidence, and we do have this permanent tension between those groups, and we would like to have also networks that would support more progressive faith-based organization. That's what I would like to say, acknowledging what has been said, and we hope that the conclusion will make their way to the table of the powerful and the most people who impacts on people's life. And I do think that a great representation of faith-based organization is a must. I mean, if people are religious, it's a matter of democracy. Organizations that represent their faith should be also at the table, but with, of course, being supportive of the human rights agenda. So that's where I would like to conclude as a question is how are we going to rally further movement and faith-based networks around the agenda of human rights in the context of COVID. And as I suggested, we should revivify or create networks of religious on violence against women, on reproductive health. We do have some, but they have been weakening over time. And we need also to, as I said, sort of a multilateralism approach to this issue. Thank you very much, and I was happy that we overcome some difficulties of connection and be part of this very interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency Aminata Toure. It has been a very, very rich panel with a lot of contributions in terms of issues, challenges, and way forward. I'd like to remind us that we will have a break of about 15 minutes before we break into dialogue table groups of 3 of them, which will be going on simultaneously. One will be on education, the other one will be on religious literacy, and the third one is on cultural diversity. But before we break, may I just echo a few thoughts that have arisen out of the key speakers' message and the panelists. The key speaker has clearly reminded that conflict has many causes, and when religion is evoked, it is a lie because it is misuse of religion. Secondly, that as a center in Oslo for Peace, they work with grassroots communities, young people, men and women, and so they have peace clubs. I think what is important is all of religious communities and not as religious organizations in fostering peace and ensuring that all are included. Empowerment of women is a second cornerstone to securing sustainable development goals, without which we will not have achieved much. And I think what the Chief Rabbi Shlomo has reminded us is that both men and women are created in the image of God. And this is what I think the World Council tries to push in terms of securing, developing, establishing, restoring communities of men and women, so that both are understood to contribute differently but also equally. At the same time, an issue on financing and access has become very critical, as well as awareness. We saw that the financing is reduced, and yet there is this illicit finance transfers from the continent of Africa in particular. Women have very little access to various places of markets as well as financing their activities. Impact of COVID, and we have seen it. We've been discussing it in the World Council Governance Group, particularly the executive. How is it impacting the faith communities? I think one of the saddest things was when some governments could open institutions like and places, social places, and still close shrines, temples, and churches and mosques. But the key question when it comes to young men and women is the fact that they are challenging us to seek ways in which we can live sustainably so that everyone has dignity, everyone is recognized and respected. His Excellency Shelmang Nebundevik did raise a number of ethical values that we need to carry on in this debate: trust, confidentiality, and all the issues around being able to work together. The systems are in place in some places, but they are not adequate and they are not yet fully inclusive. I think Professor Dr. Azakaram did indicate some of the interreligious structures in this continent have gone to the lower level and included traditional religious leaders. The point that has also been raised and which some of the groups might want to debate further is the whole issue of the narratives of empowerment that actually are not empowering, and the silenced voices. How do we make sure as we move forward towards empowerment that all are included at all levels? I think peace building, peace agreements has illustrated the issue very, very succinctly. Finally, I think I'd like to raise the issue that was raised, and that is concerning emergencies. Act Alliance was mentioned, which is part of the ecumenical movement, that is action by churches together. But many speakers have actually touched issue of humanitarian assistance. Religions for Peace has a fund. At some levels of our member churches, we have funds as well. When it comes to empowerment of women and youth, and especially the vulnerable people, I think the chief rabbi has actually indicated the dilemmas. The fact that they are even lumped together shows the people living with disability and so forth. There is need for us to think through. So both ways forward, but also challenges. For us in the World Council of Churches, the issue of gender has been very problematic, but policies have been put in place, and of course you cannot force a member, it is a free thing, but we have tried to secure representation of women, young people, of people with disability. The other thing that has been interrogated by the African Conference of Churches is the false theologies around some of these viruses, and which we would want to create, as the chief rabbi clearly said. So to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, your excellencies, esteemed panelists, and our chief speaker, it is a question of human dignity. It is a question of respect. It is a question of acknowledging that without harnessing all the talents that God endowed human race, and without understanding that those talents have to be utilized in a manner that we will achieve sustainable development for all. Beijing platform shows a lot of fault lines. So may I now, perhaps if the manager can indicate to us if we have a few minutes to ask members from the panel at least 2 or 3 questions. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much, panelists, and we wish well for those who are moving. I'll hand over to the manager to indicate about the 3 simultaneous dialogue groups, roundtable groups. Thank you and blessings.